welcome to Deep Cuts, a show that explores the good, the bad, and the gory in all your favorite horror movies. I'm your host, Matthew Bolton, and today we're talking about the Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont remake of the 1958 classic, The Blob. After making his directorial debut on the 1987 commercially successful film, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors, director Chuck Russell reteamed with writer Frank Darabont to bring us The Blob. The film was a commercial flop at the box office, but it didn't stop it from becoming an instant classic amongst horror fans. Although the original was much less gory, and definitely earned its place in horror history, the 1988 remake always holds a special place in my heart for the spectacular use of practical makeup effects by Tony Gardner. And just how much gorier was this remake? Well, let's get right to it and find out. The movie opens with a 3-minute and 37-second title sequence over shots of the seemingly empty small town of Aberville, Colorado. But it turns out the entire town is at a high school football game cheering on star player Paul Taylor as he catches a touchdown pass. After telling his best friend and creeper Scott that timing is everything when it comes to asking out cheerleader and future Jigsaw victim Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, Paul jumps back in the game and moments later is knocked off field into the sidelines. He ends up at the feet of Meg, who he then asks out on a date. See, Scott, timing is everything. Meanwhile, at an abandoned and broken wooden bridge in the middle of nowhere, town bad boy Brian Flagg, played by Kevin Dillon, is preparing to burn off some testosterone and jump the gap in the bridge. In a great bit of editing from editors Todd Furman and Terry Stokes, we see the crowd cheering on the football team intercut with shots of Brian revving his engine to jump the bridge. But unfortunately for Brian, he spent too much time working on his hair and not enough time working on his bike, and crashes due to the engine backfiring. At least there was no one around to see it. Later that night, a mysterious glowing object crashes in the woods while Paul and Scott buy condoms at the local pharmacy. Scott is accosted by Reverend Meeker about missing church, while pharmacist Mr. Penny returns with a choice in condoms for Scott. Feeling guilty, Scott says he's buying the condoms for Paul, who sets up a fantastic reaction from Mr. Penny.
Hey, come on, Scott, what's the holdup? I can't keep this girl waiting.
The boy doesn't need condoms. He needs a muzzle.
Back in the woods, the homeless man from earlier stumbles upon the crater that is glowing. Upon further inspection, the man sees that there's movement inside the crater and does what any person would do in this situation. He pokes it with a fucking stick. After pulling out some gray goo from the crater, he takes a closer look, only to have the slime jump on his hand. We jump to Meg's house, where her younger brother Kevin and his friend Eddie are heading out to catch a movie, while Meg's mother helps her pick out what to wear on her date. Paul arrives, and Meg brings him in to meet her father, who is revealed behind a newspaper to be Mr. Penny from the pharmacy. Back out in the woods, Brian finally puts down the hairspray and puts in some work on his bike, when he's startled by a sound. He looks around at the light on the front of his bike when, holy shit, it's the homeless guy and he's trying to chop his arm off with a hatchet. Brian is able to stop him before he does, and the two run off into the woods. Meg and Paul make their way on their date when the homeless man runs out in front of their car, getting hit. Rough night, old man. They all toss him in Paul's car and take him to the hospital, where we come to find out he doesn't have insurance? After bitching out the nurse a bit, the homeless man is moved to a back room to be seen. But not before Brian can show Meg he's not all motorcycle grease and hairspray.
Hey, take it easy, old dude. These guys gonna fix you right up.
Paul takes a break from filling out paperwork to grab Meg a soda and realizes that the homeless man is in some pretty bad shape. He grabs a doctor who comes to see if he can put a band-aid on the— oh my god! Paul runs to call Sheriff Herb Geller when he is stalked and eventually covered by the Blob. Meg hears Paul's screams and runs back to see one of the greatest practical effects ever to grace the silver screen. Paul is screaming for his life while being dissolved underneath the Blob. Meg tries to help but is knocked out cold when Paul's arm dislodges and sends her back against a nearby wall. Somehow the Blob just leaves her and the rest of the hospital staff alone and, I guess, flees? It's not really clear. Later, the sheriff walks Meg away from the hospital and sends her home with her parents before forging a vendetta against whoever killed his favorite high school wide receiver. Meanwhile, at a makeout spot in the woods overlooking the police activity below, Creeper Scott is mixing up some super rapey cherry coolers in his trunk, hoping to get his date Vicky drunk enough to let him sleep with her. As Scott mixes, the Blob creeps its way into the car with Vicky. When Scott returns with fresh drinks, he sees that Vicky is passed out in the front seat. Scott starts unbuttoning her blouse, but is dealt some serious justice when the Blob devours him through Vicky's corpse. Good riddance, you fucking creep. Back at the police station, Brian is being interrogated by Sheriff Geller and his super pissed off Deputy Briggs. Things get a bit hot and heavy before the sheriff stops things from going too far. They let Brian go because they have nothing on him, and he runs into Meg outside, who came to bail him out. Brian sends Meg packing before stopping into Fran's for a bite to eat. Meg doesn't take no for an answer, however, and returns to the diner to sit with Brian and talk about the goings-on. And they seemingly hit it off. In the back, Fran tries to clear a clogged drain in the sink, and her busser, George, comes to her aid. After the plunger is a no-go, George reaches his arm into the drain, only to be pulled in head first as Fran discovers him and alerts the two in the dining room. Everyone watches as George is pulled in through the pipes. Jesus Christ. The Blob escapes the pipes and chases Meg and Brian to a freezer where they realize it hates the cold. Fran is able to escape into the alley and finds a phone booth outside. She calls Sheriff Geller, who she comes to find out already went down to the diner. Fran sees Herb's body in the Blob and realizes she's trapped in the phone booth. She struggles to keep the Blob out, and eventually, holy shit, that was awesome! Brian and Meg leave the freezer, and Reverend Meeker creepily believes he's witnessing a miracle. He creeps inside the freezer, where he captures a frozen speck of the Blob stuck in the icy floor. Brian and Meg flee in Meg's car when they come across Deputy Briggs's empty cruiser. Now Sheriff Briggs? When they wander through the woods looking for him, they're greeted with an army of white hazmat suit wearing government agents. They're a team of biological scientists led by Dr. Meadows, and we're reminded once again that Brian is a tough, wisecracking guy.
The men from Gladiator are showing us how to keep our leftovers fresh.
Dr. Meadows explains to Brian and Meg that a meteor crashed and brought an alien bacteria with it, giving us this great one-liner from Kevin Dillon.
Well, your meteor brought something, all right. But if it's a germ, it's the biggest son of a bitch you've ever seen.
We jump to the movie theater and catch up with Kevin and Eddie as they're enjoying a horror movie. In the projection booth, Hobbs, the projectionist, is concerned that the AC is broken and goes to investigate with his cool Blade Bloodrave DJ glasses, only to meet the Blob firsthand. The theater manager comes to check on Hobbs, only to find him completely engulfed in the Blob on the ceiling, and he gets killed in the process. Back in the mobile lab in the woods, Dr. Meadows holds Brian and Meg against their will in the back of a van that's headed back to town. Brian picks the lock and hops out the back, but Meg stays because she's a good girl who doesn't want to get in any more trouble. She's brought back to town and reunited with her parents, who tell her that her brother is at the movies, and she runs off to find them. Back at the movie theater, the Blob is having itself an all-you-can-eat buffet of shitty movie patrons, and the boys are trapped inside. Shit is blowing off in there, and Meg arrives in the nick of time to get the boys out of there. The three barely escape into the alley before heading down into the sewer to escape a dead end. Back in the woods, Brian has grabbed his bike, and he tries to flee before stumbling upon the scientists removing the meteor from the crater. Brian sees that it's not a meteor at all, and that it's a man-made US satellite that crashed, releasing the Blob that is a US biological weapon. Mr. Jennings has an issue with releasing a biological weapon on an innocent town, and Dr. Meadows shuts his shit down like a boss. Brian overhears a walkie conversation that lets him know that the Blob chased Meg and the boys into the sewer and bails to go help. Dr. Meadows sees Brian and sends a team after him as he takes down a red shirt in a hazmat suit. Brian tries to escape the government lackeys on his bike. When he's finally able to do it, he's finally able to make that jump he's always wanted to over the broken bridge. Yes! Look at that! You see that truck flipping over? That's some cool shit! Since this is apparently the only exit route through the woods, Brian gets out and way ahead of the team pursuing him. He finds and enters the sewer through a large pipe in the woods. Back in town, Dr. Meadows arrives and devises a plan to trap the Blob in the sewers. Unfortunately for Meg and the boys, they're also trapped down there, trying to push their way through deep gray water. Gross. After a few sewer rats get pulled under, Meg tries to get the boys out of there, but unfortunately for Eddie, he's not a fast climber and is pulled back into the water by the Blob. Meg goes to save him while Kevin watches and calls out to her. She can't find Eddie, but he soon pops up, showing us that this movie is not afraid to kill off a kid and show us that the stakes are high. Kevin is small enough to fit through a sewer drain, but unfortunately for Meg, she's too big. Some of the government red suits arrive to distract the Blob by shooting it, and one is taken out immediately. Meg falls into the water and climbs out, only to be saved by Brian and his motorcycle. The two ride through the pipes, narrowly avoiding the Blob, only to run out of pipe and wipe out. With Brian's bike trashed, the two run into another hazmat soldier, played by horror legend Bill Moseley, only to be sealed into the sewer by Dr. Meadows. Brian, Meg, and Moseley are all trapped as the Blob approaches them for supper. Meg spots a bazooka in Moseley's pack, and Brian blows the lid off the sewer to escape. Brian climbs out, grabs a gun, and Deputy Briggs with about a dozen soldiers draw weapons back. It's a standoff, and Dr. Meadows tries to convince everyone that Brian is infected with a disease, and Brian whistleblows the entire operation. Dr. Meadows is pulled into the sewer by the Blob, and the remaining soldiers decide to unload into the sewer. They then try to blow the Blob up, except it doesn't really do much but piss it off. All hell breaks loose and everyone in town tries to flee, except for Reverend Meeker, who seemingly has lost his goddamn mind. A soldier tries to burn the Blob with a flamethrower, but is hilariously blown up in the process. This also sets Reverend Meeker ablaze, and Meg is able to put him out with a nearby fire extinguisher, showing the townspeople that the Blob hates the cold. All the townspeople flee to City Hall, where they barricade themselves in. Deputy Briggs is snapped in half and pulled out by the Blob in another excellent display of great practical effects by Tony Gardner. Meanwhile, Brian has stolen a snow truck from Moss Garage and drives it into town to spray the Blob with snow. The Blob fights back, flipping the snow truck over with Brian inside, and the container that holds all the cooling agent is dislodged from the truck. Meg knows that she needs to draw the Blob over to it and takes a fallen soldier's gun and explosives. In a total display of badassery, Meg shoots the Blob to scare it away from Brian in the truck, before setting a charge against the cooling agent. And holy shit, when Meg tries to outrun the blast, she gets caught on a cable and is stuck to the tank. Brian runs over to her aid, and the two barely make it out alive before the container explodes, freezing the Blob to death and leaving the town in a flurry of white snow and ice. The townspeople rejoice, and the Blob remains frozen in the middle of town square. The movie ends with one final scene of Reverend Meeker in a pop-up tent church giving a sermon about keeping the faith to avoid being left behind during the rapture. He finishes the sermon and returns to his quarters, where a patron asks him when he believes the rapture will happen. He looks upon his sample of the Blob in the jar and says,
"The Lord will give me a sign."
And there you have it, the 1988 remake of the sci-fi horror classic The Blob. Director Chuck Russell would go on to bring us such movies as The Mask and The Rock's first movie role in The Scorpion King, while co-writer Frank Darabont would bring us such movies as The Shawshank Redemption, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, The Mist, and eventually developed The Walking Dead for television. Join me next week where I travel to your favorite cabin in the woods to see everything that the Evil Dead has to offer. Until then, I've been your host Matthew Bolton, and this has been Deep Cuts. Thank you so much for watching my second episode of Deep Cuts. If you liked the episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know what you thought in the comments below. Until then, I'll see you next week. Stay screaming.